Ukraine has lost a symbolic stronghold in Donetsk, but its troops have advanced in Vovchansk, despite stunning footage of a massive Russian bomb, prompting bogus speculation that it may have been the largest non-nuclear weapon in the world. We're in Kharkiv. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with what's happening in Vuhledar. Ukraine has confirmed that its troops have been ordered to retreat from that town in southeastern Donetsk, or at least in the southeastern portion of the front line, once home to 14,000 people. Only a few handfuls remain. It has been on the front line for 2 years, ever since Russian forces captured the neighbouring town of Pavlivka, and it has been the scene of ferocious fighting throughout this conflict. Indeed, it was around that town there were reports of one of the largest tank battles of the war in February 2023, where there were suggestions that Russia had lost dozens of tanks, hundreds of men and armoured fighting vehicles. Ukraine has held on there for many, many months, but it's on that part of the Donetsk front line where Russia has been pushing relentlessly hard over the last weeks and months. And as they take that town, that makes Pokrovsk, a town we've talked about many times on this show, ever more vulnerable, because it will allow Russian forces to advance towards Pokrovsk from the south, as they also continue to attack from the east. Now, President Vladimir Zelensky has today said that lives are more important than buildings, and that's his justification for giving that order for soldiers to retreat, because they were effectively, within the last week, surrounded on three sides, and their positions had become increasingly untenable. Those troops were at risk of being surrounded, and they would have died to save what is really the ruins of the town. But that is a very difficult calculation, and it's a calculation that Ukraine makes differently place by place, because of course you remember Bakhmut, where Ukraine lost large numbers of soldiers. It was inflicting huge losses against Russia, and indeed across that front, places like Avdiivka, these towns that have become synonymous with Ukraine's resistance, which have also ultimately fallen to this scorched earth march of Russian forces. Now, further north in Vovchansk, in Kharkiv province, Ukrainian forces have been making gains, and that may be because some of the Russian forces who are occupying that Vovchansk front were pulled away to assist their comrades further to the west in Kursk, where Ukraine had launched that surprise attack into sovereign Russian territory. Britain's defence intelligence update suggesting that Ukraine had recently retaken control of the Vovchansk chemical plant in Vovchansk, which had been a Russian tactical headquarters, a tactical base, and that control of that plant, Ukrainian control of that plant, may now limit Russian operations and enable further Ukrainian operations against those Russian occupiers. It was in Vovchansk that footage emerged in the last few days of a massive explosion as a result of an airstrike. Now, the footage, which appears to have been filmed from a drone, shows a hellscape of devastated apartment tower blocks that have already clearly been heavily damaged by ferocious fighting. What appears to be some sort of bomb or missile drops into the screen from the upper right-hand corner before erupting in an enormous explosion, sending a huge shockwave hundreds of meters away from the blast site, and then an enormous mushroom cloud lifts into the sky. Now, that prompted speculation that this had been a weapon known as the father of all bombs, sometimes referred to as the ODAB 9000, thought to be the largest conventional weapon in the world, the largest non-nuclear weapon in the world. However, whilst it's easy to see from that footage why people might have speculated on the size and the scale of this weapon, those claims appear to have been debunked over the last couple of days by weapons experts, suggesting that bomb, the ODAB 9000, is in fact experimental. So far, it's had only been known that it could be dropped sort of directly over target by certain types of heavy strategic bombers. And Ukraine has said that none of those bombers were known to have been airborne at the time of that strike. Russia does have a number of other enormous munitions, including FAB, ODAB glide bombs. There's a 1,500 variant, there's a 3,000 variant. These refer to the size of the explosive payload. And we know that these glide bombs, which are effectively old-fashioned, dumb bombs that have been modified with a glide package, which allows them to maneuver onto targets and makes them more accurate. It's a way of upgrading relatively cheap and abundant weapons to make them more sophisticated, accurate weapons. These glide bombs have been causing huge devastation across the front lines. Russia seems to have large stockpiles, and indeed in the most recent tranche of military aid from America, America promised to provide Ukraine with an equivalent weapon with which to reply. A couple of other updates to mention. Ukraine claims it's destroyed one of Russia's most sophisticated air defense radars, a Nebo-M radar, which has a range. It can detect targets up to 620 miles away. It hasn't said where that's happened, and the suggestion is that this is one of only about 10 of these Nebo-Ms deployed to Ukraine. If it's correct, that would be a significant boost for Ukraine, because taking out that kind of surveillance capability likely paves the way for other types of attacks. And it's taking away the early warning, which would allow other weapons, perhaps like the Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the ATACMS or the Scalps, to hit valuable targets which had been protected by that radar defense battery. And another thing to mention, we talked about it last week, those spectacular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian ammunition depot at Toropets in Tver province, almost 300 miles north of Ukrainian territory. Similar footage emerging from that of enormous fireballs, mushroom clouds erupting into the sky. Britain's defence intelligence has confirmed that it estimated around 30,000 tons of ammunition was destroyed in those strikes. That's a figure we had heard before, but we hadn't heard it from such an authoritative source. And the British Ministry of Defence there saying that that destruction of ammunition is bound to have a significant, if only short-term, perhaps medium-term impact on Russia's ability to supply its forces across the front line with small arms ammunition and the sorts of shells and rockets that were stored on those locations. One other thing, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has stepped down after a 10-year stint at the helm of the NATO alliance. And in one of his valedictory interviews, he stressed the importance of NATO allies not being scared off, deterred by Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats. Now, he's echoing that same sentiment that we've heard from British former defence secretaries, that we've heard from the UK and American spy chiefs, all of them warning not to be scared by Russia's nuclear saber-rattling. Stoltenberg's message was, he said, his fear was that if Vladimir Putin were to win this war in Ukraine, then the message that sends to the rest of the world is that might is right and that NATO will back down if threatened. And he said that potentially spells far, far worse, more terrifying prospects for the future. The eyes of the world this week have, of course, been distracted from Ukraine. They've been looking at events in the Middle East, where Israel has launched a ground invasion into neighbouring Lebanon, and Iran launched a volley of more than 180 ballistic missiles at Israel. Now, we're not going to get too much into that conflict. That's not what Frontline is about. But what we did see was Israel's Western allies, this time like they did in April, coming to Israel's support to shoot down some of those ballistic missiles. Most recently, it was 2 US destroyers using their ballistic missile defense systems to shoot down what US officials called a handful of Iranian rockets. We know that Jordanian Patriot batteries were also involved in shooting down those missiles. And the reason I bring this up is because President Zelensky has raised this in Kyiv today, effectively asking the question whether the lives of people in the Middle East are worth more than the lives of people in Ukraine. Why, he asks, is the West, is America willing to shoot down Iranian missiles with American weapons directly, with American service people directly involved, but not willing to do that over Ukraine, where Ukrainian civilians and soldiers are paying the ultimate price on a daily basis from similar assaults, similar missile bombardments, similar drone attacks from Russia. Now, as ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. And if I can't answer them, then I will get into the comments, as you know, and try and answer some of them there. First question, will Putin be deposed? We've heard this question before. The short answer is it's very unlikely. I don't think so. The closest we came was when the Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin led a sort of mad march on Moscow. It didn't end very well, and Prigozhin was ultimately killed in a plane crash. There's no evidence, nothing we can see so far, to suggest other people are plotting against Putin within his own circle. Question number 2, does Putin understand the principles of MAD? That's mutually assured destruction. The idea that if one side launches a nuclear weapon, the others will respond. Both sides will ultimately be annihilated by the exchange of doomsday nuclear weapons. He certainly does. And he's banking on the West's mutual understanding of mutually assured destruction, that he's banking on the fact that the West is afraid to respond. He's perhaps relying on this sense that he would be madder than they would, that he would use nuclear weapons first, a tactical nuclear weapon, perhaps a smaller nuclear weapon, that would leave the West in a quandary, because were Russia to launch a small nuclear weapon against Ukraine, that would not necessarily trigger a massive nuclear counterattack from the West. It would leave the world in a sort of unprecedented situation, and it's that threat of uncertainty and instability and pushing the world to the brink of a potentially much bigger, potentially disastrous conflict, which Vladimir Putin is leveraging to his advantage in trying to deter Western support for Ukraine, trying to deter or limit how much help the West gives Kyiv. Why does Ukraine need permission to use missiles? It comes back to that same point. The West is not giving it permission, specifically to use Storm Shadow and Scalp against Russian targets inside Russia, because there is fear of that escalation, and that concern primarily coming from the White House. Why all the hesitation? Why hadn't the West just given Ukraine all these weapons at the beginning of the war? Perhaps they would have been able to win immediately. It's a good question. Why hadn't the West given Ukraine these weapons before the war started? Because it might have avoided the war in the first place. But always, it is a delicate balance between deterrence and provocation. And this is an incredibly difficult tightrope for all countries, and particularly Ukraine's allies, to walk. There are many in Ukraine who would argue quite convincingly that if they'd been given these weapons, if they'd had these abilities, Russia would never have dared to attack it. But there's equally an argument that had the West given Ukraine all sorts of weapons before there was a conflict, that would have been seen as hugely provocative, installing threats to Russia on Russia's doorstep, which might have triggered, provoked an invasion where there was not going to be one. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we could argue the what-ifs all the time, but that's the reason why it's ultimately treading that line between deterrence and provocation. Could UN peacekeepers rebuild Ukraine in the event of a peace deal? It's certainly a possibility. There's many, many hypotheticals between where we are now and where we'd need to get to for that to be a reality. Ukraine insisting as part of its peace plan, it still wants Russia to leave all of the Ukrainian territory it has occupied, and it wants NATO membership as a guarantee. Ukraine wants NATO membership as a guarantee of its security. It doesn't want UN peacekeepers. Post-2014, when Russia annexed parts of the Donbass and illegally occupied Crimea, the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, provided monitors across the front line, and whilst they tracked ceasefire violations, they were ultimately unable to avoid this conflict spiraling as it has done. Why has no one won? Really good question. Ultimately, that's because right now two sides are almost evenly matched and both continue to have the will to fight, and the will to fight is stronger at the moment than the will to talk, and it's only whether one side collapses or whether both sides want to talk that will change. A-10s, why hasn't Ukraine got the A-10 tank buster planes? We've had this question before. The short answer, the very short answer, is because Ukraine doesn't want them. It hasn't asked for them. It's consistently asked for F-16s. Those are all the questions for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you do have any questions, please, and you're watching on YouTube, do ask them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can next time.